Begin the process of making some of our iris striations. Alright, so here's where we left off in our last lesson. So as you can see, we still have a lot of work to do before we could really call this good. So what we're going to begin doing in this lesson is to actually start the process of actually creating some of the different striations that we would actually find in the iris itself. Alright, now just like I had mentioned in the previous lesson, this process really just involves a lot of layering so we can actually start to get all the detail that we want. So as we begin this process, it will start to look pretty rough, but as we start to proceed through some of our next lessons, this will actually start to really come together. So what I'm going to do is take this layer and we'll make a new one just right up above it. And now, just like what we did before, I'm going to press Alt and Shift, come in here and actually draw out a selection. Let's actually come in and try that again. So come in, draw out a selection to where it's roughly about half the distance between the center of the eye and this outer part of the iris. Alright, and I'll come in and just fill this with really any color. And now what I will begin to do is to come in and I'll just use something like my eraser tool, and I'll come in and just knock out a few of these little edges here and just try to make this look a little bit more irregular. So that way this isn't perfectly round. This will be sort of the starting part of some of these different iris striations. Now in order to start to get this sort of softened out, what I like to do is just come in with something like a radial blur and then start to actually kind of blur this out. So now that we have this sort of nice and irregular, let's come into the filter, go to blur, and we'll use the radial blur. Alright. Now by default this radius blur is set to a spin method, which is actually going to make this look like sort of like a car tire that's spinning around as far as the blur is concerned. What we want to do though is actually use a zoom, so it actually pulls all these different corners out. Now this is actually going to zoom from the center of my document, so that's another one of the important reasons why I've actually made sure that this is all centered up. So let's switch this to a zoom method. We'll go ahead and really start to crank up this amount so that way we get a nice large blur here. Once we're done, press OK, and there we are. Now you can see how it sort of pulled these out, and now we can begin the process of actually making these different striations. So a good tool for this is to use something like the smudge tool, and we'll get in here a little bit tighter. Now unfortunately this is the part where it's going to start to get a little bit tedious, because there's actually just a lot of little striations and things like that to have to actually come in and begin building. So unfortunately this is really not going to be a quick and easy solution. So let's come in and we'll start to find sort of a nice small brush size. In my case I'm going to use about 5 pixels, looks like about right. And I'll go ahead and make sure my strength for this is fairly high. Something like 95 or 90 should do. But really the size of your document will make a pretty big difference, so the settings that you wind up using for your smudge tool may actually be quite a bit different than mine. Right, and so what we can now start to do is begin using our smudge tool and just starting to kind of smudge some of these different lines out. Now this process is actually a lot easier if you have something like a digital tablet to be able to work on, which is what I'm using right now. And so now it becomes much easier to come in and just begin pulling these different striations out. Alright, so you can start to see these beginning to come about. Now, just like what we had done before, I want to try to come in and make sure that I have a lot of nice layers in here. So one way that we can sort of start to fake that appearance of a whole bunch of different layers is to use some more of these layer effects. So I'm just going to double click on this layer. I'll use my same outer glow that I had used before. And just like before, I'm going to set the blend mode to normal and set this swatch to black, so that way we get almost the appearance of a drop shadow, but instead of a drop shadow where it sort of falls off in one direction, this outer glow is even in all directions, sort of like ambient occlusion. And we can start to bring this opacity down. There we go. And you can start to see how that begins adding some of these really subtle little overlapping effects in here. So as I start to now proceed with actually smudging some of these lines out, you can see how it just gives just a little bit more depth to this. Now in my case this is probably a little bit too high, so I'm going to back this down a little bit. There we go. Now with this strength set down a little bit lower, you can now see just a little bit more of this overlapping effect that we're starting to get here with some of these different eye striations. So as I'm starting to pull these out, you'll notice I'm actually trying to move my hand just a little bit as far as creating just sort of these little waves within the different iris striations. Very rarely are these lines going to be nice and straight, so I like to try to always incorporate a little bit more of this irregularity in here, and just coming in here and just gradually sort of layering these on. So, like I said, not the most exciting thing in the world at this point, but really there's no other easy way to do this. This is the way that's going to give us the most amount of control and really the most precision. Although, like I said, it's really not the most exciting thing at this point. You can really just start to see how this is very quickly coming together, though, without just a whole lot of effort. I'll try and incorporate a few more of these hand movements in here. It looks like some of these you can see we're starting to get a little bit too straight. So I'll just make sure that I keep my hand moving, keep my wrist moving as I'm starting to make these strokes. And just working my way around. Alright, so I can go ahead and just continue through this process. Alright, so go ahead and I've just taken the liberty of going ahead and just continuing and finishing out these little iris striations as opposed to having you sit and watch me complete this whole thing. So really just continuing these different strokes. Now, as we've been smudging these out, you may have noticed that we actually have some of these different strokes that are actually sort of proceeding outside of this line around the actual iris itself. So what we could do is just simply take the outline of this layer 1, which is this area back in here. If I control-click on that layer, I can actually select all the visible elements on this layer. And now on layer 3, if I select this layer with this outline still enabled, I can go ahead and just click on this Add Mask. And you can see now this will actually create a layer mask for this new iris layer. And that'll basically just clip everything out that was previously outside of this area. Alright, so you can now start to see some of these different striations. Now at the moment these are still completely white. Now rather than actually coming in and trying to hand paint this, one of the things that I like to do is to very quickly add in just something like a hue and saturation adjustment layer. So if I were to come in and press and hold the Alt key on my keyboard, then come down and add hue saturation. If I press and hold the Alt key, it'll give me the option to actually link this hue and saturation adjustment layer to my selected layer. So I'm going to go ahead and enable that checkbox, press OK, and now what we can start to do is come in, and if we enable something like the Colorize checkbox, now we can start to come in here, and if we start to drop down the lightness, begin dropping down the saturation, now we can come in here and just really interactively find some kind of a coloration that will work for us. So again, at this point, I'm not going to be too terribly concerned with the actual coloration, because once we start to add in some of these additional layers for the iris and start to get closer to completing this, then we can start to really focus a little bit more on some of these final colorations. But you can start to see with really just very little effort, now within just the course of a couple of minutes, how we've really started to create the illusion of a lot of depth, really actually more depth than what we actually have, but it's starting to really come together after even just a few minutes. So what we'll start to do in our next lesson is continue this process of actually starting to layer on some of these different iris striations in order to start to create some different color variations within this eye.